You find yourself in an uncomfortable plastic chair, manufactured sometime in the 1970s. Your ticket number is 72. They just called 46. All you need is a lousy license renewal. You reach for your phone, only to find that the battery's dead and there's no way to charge. Clock on the wall looks like it too is straight from the 70s. You curse the fact that it has a second hand. I mean, it's bad enough that time is creeping slowly forward, let alone that you have to watch it drag its feet. You're bored out of your skull. Now, Leo Tolstoy described boredom as the desire for desires. We want when we're bored. We want some activity to engage in that matters to us. So if boredom is a call to action to find something worth doing, why not take the Nike road? Just do it. If it were that simple, boredom wouldn't feel so uncomfortable, something we generally try to avoid at all costs. We want something meaningful to do when we're bored. We just don't want anything that's currently available to us. Now, if boredom is so uncomfortable, why do we even feel it? Every parent knows this conundrum. When their child grumbles, "I'm bored," what they're really saying is, "I'm bored and I want you to fix it for me." So, as the dutiful parent, we trot out options. Why don't you go play basketball with your friends? Read a book. Or perhaps just play with your Legos. And yet at every turn, the child dismisses all options for engagement. Nah, don't wanna. Listing off all of the things that they ought to be able to launch into is a little like telling a drowning person to simply swim to shore. If they could, they would. Now, they're not being lazy. They're just saying, "I've thought of those things already and I'm still bored. I don't want anything that's right here in front of me." And when we're bored, we're no different. We too could list off the possibilities. It's just that we don't want to do those particular things at this particular moment. So boredom is the uncomfortable feeling of an unmet desire to be engaged in something meaningful. I feel boredom acutely, kind of bored child stuck in an adult body. It's part of the reason I've spent the last 15 years researching it, trying to understand the behaviours that drive it and the brain states that support it. Medice cura te ipsum. Physician, heal thyself. And one thing I've come to understand about boredom is that it's not there to make us bored. Pain provides a useful analogy. The function of pain is not to cause hurt. It's to galvanise us into action, to address whatever caused the pain in the first place, and to get us back on track with whatever we were doing. Boredom is a warning light, telling us that we're not effectively engaged with the world. We know there are things that we could be doing, but for all those possibilities, it feels like something's missing. Whatever it is that we could do doesn't feel like it would be enough. In other words, there's a mismatch between what we want and what the world currently has to offer. I know that's how it feels for me when I get bored. I start pacing around my living room, casting about, looking for something to do, but failing to find anything that I think will satisfy. Even my most trusty boredom solution, my semi-acoustic Fender, fails at times. I tinker around on it for a while, but nothing really seems to flow, so I abandon it in the search for something else that I hope might do the trick. Now, Erich Fromm, a 20th century philosopher and sociologist, once claimed that man is the only animal that can be bored. He's wrong. And the fact that animals too can feel boredom suggests that it's more than just a mere character failing. Somewhere in our evolutionary past, boredom was selected for, which begs the question of why. In animals, boredom seems obvious. Think of the lion pacing in their cage. Or even your dog, when he chews on your shoe if you leave him alone for too long, is telling you he's bored. These are both instances of an animal prevented from engaging with the world in purposeful ways. They're not unlike the pleading child, wanting something to do, but failing to satisfy that want. Now, it's true that the challenge laid bare by boredom, find something worth doing and launch into it, is not an easy one. Some of us struggle with the warning light more than others. And there are some hard truths that I have to face in the recognition that I'm a guy who suffers from the very thing he studies. We know that people who struggle with self-control tend to be boredom prone. So sticking to your New Year's resolutions, or deciding not to have another slice of cake, or on a grander scale, planning out your career path. Each of these things requires some amount of self-control, the ability to marshal your thoughts, actions, and emotions in the pursuit of a goal. And for the boredom prone, this is hard to do. More than just self-control though, self-esteem is critical. And I don't mean whether or not you feel good about who you are, but whether or not you believe yourself to be an effective actor in the world. Believing that we are the authors of our own lives is what psychologists refer to as agency, and it feels good when we have it and terrible when it's ripped away from us. Even the illusion of agency feels good. So the closed door buttons on the inside of elevators and many of the crosswalk buttons on New York City streets are useless. They actually do nothing. And yet, it feels good to push them and believe that we've had an influence anyway. Meanwhile, back at the DMV, boredom descends so painfully precisely because we have no control over how things progress. Now, we've long known that being prone to boredom is bad for our mental health. Higher rates of depression and anxiety, increased hostility, higher drug and alcohol use and problem gambling, these things are all associated with being boredom prone. More recently, we've learned that our attachments to our smartphone and social media can go from attachment to addiction when we turn to these things as pacifiers of boredom. These pacifiers, our smartphones, a slot machine, one more pint, work well to occupy our time, but they do very little to satisfy that desire to be an effective agent. When we're bored, we see it as a kind of failing in ourselves. Perhaps we're not clever enough or creative enough to find something worth doing. Or even worse, perhaps we're just being lazy. But you wouldn't accuse your dog of laziness or a lack of creativity when he murders your shoe. He was bored and needed something to do. Now, the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once claimed that boredom was the root of all evil. And there's certainly no shortage of extreme examples that make his point seem plausible. Take, for instance, the story of Christopher Lane, an Australian pursuing his dream of playing Major League Baseball. While out jogging one morning in Oklahoma, 3 teenagers shot him dead. When the police asked them why they did it, one of them replied, "We were bored, so we decided to kill someone." And yet, we also want to believe that boredom can spur creativity. Remember how you were going to write the next great American novel during the pandemic lockdown? When Mike Bloomfield, a rock and roll Hall of Fame guitarist in his own right, first saw Jimi Hendrix play, he was blown away. He cornered Hendrix after the gig and said, "Man, where have you been hiding?" To which the guitar legend replied, "I've been playing the Chitlin circuit and I was bored shitless." If we want to believe that boredom could turn us into a creative genius on guitar, then you also have to accept that it could turn you into a killer. And therein lies the true message of boredom. We are trying to satisfy an urge to act, and that brings on a reckoning of sorts. My actions are my own. They have consequences for which I am responsible. It's partly why boredom feels so uncomfortable. It's a conundrum highlighting that we are the authors of our own lives, and we need to own up to that. The pleading child wants you to fix their boredom for them because right now they can't even imagine how to do it on their own. So they abdicate responsibility for their own engagement. We are no better if we succumb to the restlessness of boredom and somehow demand that the world comes to us. So if Tolstoy's right and boredom is the desire for desires, then we need to acknowledge that doing any old thing won't work. What we do has to matter to us. Whether it's Christopher Lane's killers or Jimi Hendrix's brilliance, we can't blame boredom for what we do. That choice is ours. We could choose to spend hour upon hour playing Candy Crush on our phones, and sure, we'll be occupied. But as soon as you put the phone down, there it is, staring you in the face. Boredom and the challenge to act purposefully in the world. Now, I want you to imagine a fisherman and a cork adrift in stormy seas. The cork cannot choose what to do and is completely at the mercy of the elements. The fisherman, on the other hand, could choose to ride out the storm in the hopes of catching more fish, or she could pack it in for the safety of shore. To choose to let the world come to you, to binge watch the Kardashians or dive down the Instagram rabbit hole, is to choose to be merely occupied, to choose to be the cork. Boredom is challenging us to find some activity to engage in that allows us to showcase our skills and talents, to choose to be the fisherman, to be effective agents. I could trot out a top 10 list of things for you to do when you're bored, but that would be missing the point, like the misguided parent trying to solve their child's boredom for them. If we're to fully comprehend that boredom urges us to recognise and fulfil our potential as effective agents, nobody can tell you what to do. In a sense, boredom is a little like happiness in that way. What makes me happy won't necessarily make you happy. What I find interesting might just bore you to tears. In fact, Andy Warhol once said, you need to let the little things that ordinarily bore you suddenly thrill you. Now, I can't tell you any more than Warhol could what those little things might be. Take, for instance, David Morgan, Voted Britain's dull man of 2015, David has an abiding passion for traffic cones. Now, most of us can't imagine being even remotely interested in traffic cones, but that's the point. Whatever it is for us, bird watching, stamp collecting, 18th century Russian doilies, piques our interest. It doesn't matter that others might find it boring. So, just like happiness, what makes me bored won't necessarily make you bored. What drives your boredom and your path out of it is unique to you. It has to be, if it is indeed showing you that you are an agent responsible for your own happiness. So what do? First, stay calm. It's hard, if not impossible, to figure out what matters most to us when we're pacing around our living room. Take a few deep breaths. Succumbing to the restlessness, the agitation and discomfort of boredom is what pushes us to the short-term, ultimately unsatisfying solutions of one more game of Candy Crush, one more pint, one more hour on the couch. Make a conscious effort to choose. Now, this doesn't have to be on a grand scale. Early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, we all imagined we'd been gifted all kinds of free time. Time to learn a new language, get on the sourdough train, or perhaps work on some important world issue. It didn't take long for me, at least, to figure out that I had less time. Working from home with kids and dogs as constant distractions is hard. Just a few weeks into the pandemic, I found myself at 4 p.m, bored out of my skull. So I called my mum in Australia and asked her for a cake recipe that we used to make when I was a kid, and I baked it. Now, the cake wasn't great, but it served its purpose. I was occupied, and there was a tangible product at the end of it. Nothing grand, nothing world-beating, but certainly boredom-beating. Baking a cake was of value. At times, we can choose to be the cork and just chill for a bit. But ultimately, to overcome boredom, we need to spend more time being the fisherman, choosing to engage in things that matter to us. But what are we to do when we find ourselves in that uncomfortable plastic chair with a dead phone, nothing to read, and 30 people in front of us in line at the DMV? Surely this is a cage that boredom won't allow us to escape from. Well, maybe you can't launch into some meaningful action at that point, but you can stay calm, take a breath, and think about what matters most to you. In the harried lives that many of us lead, early rise, quick breakfast, rush to work, barely breathe for a lunch break, come home, ferry the kids to soccer, quick dinner, lather, rinse, repeat, we rarely give ourselves time to think. It's hard to act in purposeful and meaningful ways when you're lurching from one action to the next without ever pausing to ask why. Boredom is a call to action, but not just any old action. We need to consciously choose to engage with the world in ways that allow us to give full expression to our skills and talents. If we can avoid succumbing to boredom's downside, we give ourselves a chance to recognise its upside. That boredom shows us that we are the authors of our own lives, that we can choose to be the fisherman. Thank you.